Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the course in which we will briefly take a look at several of the core analytic frameworks using policy analysis and some of their constraints. This week's readings and resources help us identify and understand the different analytical steps using the so-called rational linear models for policy analysis. We will also become familiar with some specific strategies to better attack the first step in the policy analysis or problem definition. And finally, we will be aware of some of the limitations of these models and the broad limitations for the analyst. So let's get into the linear model. Previously, we defined policy analysis as the use of reason and evidence to choose the best policy among a number of alternatives. To put this into context, the view of policy analysis is part of the broader conceptual framework of rational decision-making and planning, which typically follows a linear logic. Under rational decision-making, the analyst defines a problem, indicates the goals and objectives to be sought, considers a range of alternative solutions, evaluates each of the alternatives to clarify their consequences, and then recommends or chooses the alternative with the greatest potential for solving the problem. Of course, in the day-to-day work, this ideal path is subject to adjustments, and some of the steps to be taken may be performed in different orders or multiple times depending on the circumstances within which the analyst operates, as well as the problem at hand. But which are exactly the steps in the policy analysis process? This depends on a number of factors, and policy analysts think about the tasks in different ways. So here's a wide variety of formulations of the linear model, and this week we read about a few of the most commonly referred to. First, the Eightfold Path to Policy Analysis by Bardach and Patashnik. Second, the Five-Stage Framework in Kraft and Furlong. And three, the Rational Model of Policy Analysis and Planning, referred to by Patton, Sawicki, and Clark. While the models detail to varying degrees the policy analysis process, all of them hinge on a robust definition of the problem and end with the identification of optimal policy options that, given a set of predetermined criteria, help ameliorate the status quo of the system. Identifying the policy options and assessing their strengths and limitations vis-a-vis the problem is at the heart of the analytical process. For our first assignment, you already started exploring what some of these options may look like based on existing evidence on your case study. As we move along through the rest of the semester, we will build on and expand this process. First, you will define the problem in your assignment by coupling the theoretical concepts and tools which we draw from the literature on each of the steps of the policy analysis. Concrete analytical tasks that follow will enrich these established models from the definition of the problem according to the selection of the criteria, then the stakeholder analysis, then equity and health impact assessments follow from there. And you will then identify recommended policy options during the development of the final policy brief. The class lectures and readings will teach you how to conduct each step of this project. Defining the policy problem is a common opening step in policy analysis and one that sets the stage for the rest of the problem-solving process. It shapes the narrative and provides direction for the types of evidence needed to present and evaluate possible courses of action. In public policy, the problem refers to the existence of an unsatisfactory condition for which relief is sought. Decision makers who craft effective policies take particular care in defining in detail the policy problem of interest. Some general guidance questions can help us think through the different dimensions of the problem and so set the stage for the subsequent analytical work. What does the problem face and why and where does it exist? Who is affected? Are there any groups depending on their age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status that are disproportionately affected compared to others? What are the major causes of the problem? When and how did the problem develop? And finally, how might the causes of the problem be affected by policy action? Besides those questions, there are a series of additional specific strategies and techniques that analysts can deploy to craft a strong problem statement and frame the analysis. One of the most common strategies is to think in terms of deficit and excess. In other words, what's missing or what's too much. Numbers are especially powerful here. They allow us to show the size and relevance of the issue in concrete terms. To do this, we can look for databases or online courses that give us reliable figures. Even when we can't get exact numbers, an estimate or even a reasonable guess helps convey the magnitude of the problem. Of course, not every parameter can be quantified, but whenever possible, numbers provide a strong foundation for problem definition. Another essential strategy is fact-checking. Not all numbers or data are equal, and we need to be cautious. First, analyze where the fact or statistic comes from. Relying on just one source is risky, so it's best to cross-check with multiple sources, but make sure the sources are independent, otherwise you may just be repeating the same information. It's important to understand how the data were produced. Was it through a survey, an experiment, administrative data? And finally, focus on your fact. Fact-checking is the most critical piece of information for your problem definition, because those are the ones that will shape your analysis the most. The third strategy is learning how to deal with uncertainty. Uncertainty is present in almost every public policy problem. Often we simply don't have data for all the variables we would like, and this can be frustrating, but it's part of the reality of policy analysis. In fact, uncertainty lies at the heart of evaluating problems. Policies are always designed and implemented in complex environments where not everything is predictable. So instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty, policy analysts need to recognize it, acknowledge the limits of the data, and still move forward with the best available information. Often, the way a problem is presented to us, or what's called the policy envelope, is very narrow. It may reflect the client's political environment or rhetoric rather than the true scope of the issue. As analysts, we should go beyond that envelope. We should try to expand the definition of the problem beyond limited solutions that are initially proposed, and strip away the rhetoric to get to a version of the problem that is analytically manageable. This helps us ensure that we're not trapped in someone else's framing. Problem definition isn't something you do once and forget, it's an iterative process. As you dive deeper into analysis, your understanding of the issue may evolve, and that's perfectly normal. Often, it's necessary. After a few iterations, you may find a more precise and solvable problem definition. Importantly, this definition should always be negotiated and agreed upon with the client because it becomes the foundation of the policy analysis. Finally, it's useful to look for latent opportunities or more innovative ways of defining the problem. For example, can we combine efforts to greater complementarity? Are there underutilized capacities or resources we could take advantage of? We might also consider reframing choices, accounting for social effects, or finding ways to improve productivity with the same resources. Sometimes it's about adjusting prices to reflect reality better, or finding features that can perform multiple functions. In short, creative reframing of a problem can open doors to solutions that wouldn't have been visible at first glance. When defining problems, it's also important to avoid common traps, and one of these is including an implicit solution inside the problem definition. If we do that, we've essentially predetermined the outcome without proper evaluation. Instead, all solutions should be empirically tested and not assumed in advance. Another common pitfall is accepting causal claims too quickly, especially those implied in diagnostic problem statements. Being cautious here ensures that the analysis remains objective and evidence-driven. Once the problem is defined, the next step is to construct policy alternatives. This means generating different possible courses of action. Alternatives can be direct, like regulations or bans, or indirect, such as incentives and nudges. Some may involve monetary tools, while others rely on non-monetary approaches. The key is to avoid falling back on the conventional approaches that may not address the problem effectively. Innovation in designing alternatives is often essential. After laying out the alternatives, we need to find a way to evaluate them. That's where criteria come in. And we must ask which criteria are most suitable for this problem and this alternative, or this set of alternatives. What are the costs if we act, and what are the costs if we don't? Beyond costs, we also must consider effectiveness, social and political feasibility, and equity. These criteria give us a structured way to compare options. With criteria in hand, we can assess the alternatives, and here we must ask which options are most likely to achieve the desired outcomes. Different types of analysis can help distinguish stronger from weaker alternatives, whether that's cost-benefit analysis, equity impact assessment, or feasibility studies. We also need to check if the evidence does exist to make these assessments reality. If it doesn't, part of our job is figuring out how to produce it. Finally, we reach the stage of drawing conclusions. At this point, our role as analysts is to highlight which option seems most desirable given the evidence and the criteria that we've applied. But it's important to remember, we don't make the final choice. That responsibility rests with policymakers and the public. What we do is clarify trade-offs, make the consequences visible, and point to the alternative that best aligns with the goals and constraints. And of course, all of this has to be understood in light of political reality. Now that we've covered the rational or linear model of public policy analysis, let's consider its limitations. Now, even though the rational model suggests a neat step-by-step process, in reality, policy analysts face several conflicts that complicate this work. There's often tension between loyalty to the client and loyalty to one's own principles. Clients may impose restrictions on the alternatives or criteria considered, which limit the scope of analysis. Analysts also face the conflict between the need for certainty and the pressure to develop quick decisions. On top of this, there are expectations from the professional guild of policy experts, and of course, there are resource constraints, both political and economic. These conflicts make analysis much more complex than the textbooks suggest. We can also think about the role of the analyst in terms of these political and economic constraints. On one side of the spectrum, we have analysts working in-house for an employer, often with very tight constraints, and on the other, those in purely academic or think tank settings may face fewer constraints, at least formally, though they still operate within professional expectations. Some analysts volunteer or work for nonprofits, where political constraints may be looser, but economic limitations are very tight. Others engage in consulting or expert testimony, where resources may be available, but political boundaries shape the scope of this work. This matrix helps us see how context strongly influences what kind of analysis is possible. Finally, there are different types of policy analysis, each with distinct objectives. For example, scientific analysis focuses on developing knowledge, searching for truth, and developing theory, whereas professional analysis is about generating practical options to solve policy problems. And then there's political analysis, and as the name suggests, it advocates preferred policies, often those that align with certain interests or values. Each has its own approaches, limitations, and examples, but this raises important questions. Can policy analysis ever really be comprehensive, and is it ever truly value neutral? These are debates at the heart of this field. Finally, remember that this week, Discussion Board 4 and Quiz 3 are due. That is by September 21st. And I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I'll see you again next week when we cover the role of the policy analyst and how to collect evidence.